Welcome to Global Affairs Unfiltered. You're listening to Jack Stockwell. It is the 5th day of May, Cinco de Mayo, here in Utah. And it is my goal. I'm back from, let me just jump into it. I'm back from San Diego. I was participating in a conference in San Diego for several days and presented my 2 cases on concussions, traumatic brain injury, to a good reception. And I noticed as I'm checking my schedule for this week, I've got 2 more brain concussions that I am working on this week. One thing you need to remember, you cannot have a brain concussion without a neck injury. And the neck injury will occur in an area that affects blood flow to the brain. And when this area is affected negatively, blood flow into the brain and blood flow out of the brain is restricted to some degree, especially out of the brain. And there's also a restriction of the flow of cerebral spinal fluid, which is a watery, clear liquid that bathes every cell in the brain. And when you get a stagnation of this material, you're going to have the lasting effects of a concussion that is related to a decrease in the oxygenation of brain cells. And so I talked about my 2 cases that I took care of. And as I said, I noticed on the schedule 2 more this week. And I love taking care of problems like this because the results are so rapid. Both of these cases this week are very serious. One's very young. And I already know, sitting here, there's going to be an immediate change in their profile and their appearance as soon as I get that restricting problem taken care of. If you're just tuning in for the first time, you can get more information about me at forbiddendoctor.com. And I do a world global affairs show Monday, Tuesday. I do a health show on Wednesday. I have made arrangements with my webmaster that by the end of this month, we are going to redesign the whole thing. Green screen and everything else that goes with it, so it's a much more professional approach. And shorter broadcasts on the stream, even though I will still maintain a 2-hour show at K-Talk. So let's get into what's going on. There's several things I want to talk about. I want to do an update on all the hot spots around the planet, because there are plenty of those. And, I should mention, the tower is not towering. There's no broadcast coming out of the tower. I'm broadcasting over my streaming channels at YouTube and X, and then also the stream out of K-Talk. So some of you who are listening on your smartphones or your computers will hear the show. Those who are trying to hear it over the radio, excuse me, those who are trying to hear it over the radio will not be able to do so. All right, so now while there are peace efforts going on around the planet, and I like the peace conference, the International Peace Coalition that the Schiller Institute is doing to further the efforts of peace, we're seeing very little peace being spread. In fact, there's a very disturbing increase of conflicts. And while the Ukraine situation is far from settled, obviously there is something going on there. I'm a little disturbed by President Trump's comments that it was the Allies that won World War II, when we know historically, you're going to be accurate. It's the massive destruction on the Eastern Front that the Russians did to the German army that made it possible for the Allies to mop up the mess. But it was the Russians who won the war. It's pure and simple. Or, well, the Soviets at the time. So the situation in Ukraine is far from settled. The situation in Gaza is just absolutely horrendous, beyond description, and getting worse. And we have seen now a new conflict that is arriving, which thanks, Paul, which underlies the point I'm trying to make here, that the conflicts do have regionally historic specific causes. But nevertheless, the reason that we have them is that the entire dynamic is caused by this geopolitical confrontation between what you would call the old system, which is pustulant and coughing up blood and passing blood out the bottom, and is obviously in a steep rate of decline, and a new system of the global majority, which is on the rise. And I've always tried to locate regional conflicts in the context of that larger strategic battle. So underlying all these other things that I'm often talking about going on around the planet, the impending financial doom over this entire planet, like an umbrella in a terrible windstorm that's about to go inverted, is what lies behind a lot of these other things. Now, while a specific investigation is still required to find out what caused this recent flare-up between India and Pakistan, I want to start with that, with this terrorist attack that killed 26 people in the Kashmir. That remains to be seen as the result of such an independent investigation, which would reveal what the real causes are. But if I tell you some of the circumstantial elements, I think there are some leads here. First of all, the situation is definitely escalating. Prime Minister Modi has banned all Pakistani aircraft from Indian airspace. He's also given the military a free hand to choose whatever action they deem necessary. Now, I suppose Modi, as the Prime Minister of India, has direct control over the military as much as Trump does here in America, or most nation leaders have over their military. But when Modi goes ahead to his military leaders and said, do what you got to do, I worry about something like that, because the Pakistani Army Chief of Staff has answered that by saying that any Indian military action would find a swift and robust response from the Pakistani side. And remember, both of these are nuclear-armed countries. In fact, the last report I saw, Pakistan's turned all of their missiles, and they're now aimed at India. And obviously, this has the potential of leading to a military war, which could erupt, maybe in the present, maybe currently eruption, as far as I know. But the Pakistani information minister even talked about nukes, saying that all the Pakistani nuclear weapons have been trained in the direction of India, and some of the hardliners on the Indian side are responding with that, with nuclear talk themselves of their missiles. So obviously, if this would happen, it would be a total catastrophe with just unforeseen consequences given the strategic location of India and Pakistan. Fortunately, Iran and China have tried to mediate to talk to both sides to cool the situation down. But one should also keep in mind that the Pakistani defense minister said that Pakistan has been instrumentalized too many times in the past by the Anglo-Americans. Now, he didn't say who, but we know who. Zbigniew Brzezinski, back in 1975, had briefed the Trilateral Commission in their big Tokyo meeting back then that the West would play the Islamic card against the Soviet Union. And this became, this was released, this was public information. What you're seeing now unfolding around the planet, has, as you well know, has been on the agenda for decades. Some things happen faster than other things, but it's all moving in the same direction, which is the final elimination of Russia. Even the attack on Libya in 2011 was to set the Islamic stage for an attack on Russia. So the building up of the Mujahideen and the radical Islamists was promoted in the 1980s in the Soviet Union war against Afghanistan. And naturally, after that war was over, these radicalized jihadists spread through the region to Chechnya, to Xinjiang, to Pakistan, to many other countries in the region. And obviously, as General Flynn said back in 2012 these elements were utilized by the United States. And this is an admission by an American general. And so the left has never been very much in favor of Flynn once he was put in as national security advisor in Trump's first administration. How long did it take to get him out of there? Because he was telling the truth. But he was telling the truth that all of these different factions, the jihadists, the various Islamist groups, all the fighting that was going on in these various countries was to set the stage for an Islamic attack against Russia. Now, there's been an ongoing Islamic attack against England and against France and against Germany. When you look at how many mayors in England are Muslims. Nothing against that. It's just that this invasion has been going on for some time, and the more serious ones that shoot bullets and drop bombs has all been part of a plan against Russia. And so when Flynn said that, an admission by an American general, that's a very serious situation in which I think only hope that reason will prevail here. But this is the nature of war. And I'm not downplaying it one iota. This is what you do in war. This is how war works. And in the situation in Ukraine, the new element is the New Deal was announced between the United States and Ukraine, whereby the United States would have the right to exploit some of the raw materials in the Ukraine, the rare earth elements and similar things, even though I reported at least a month ago that there was a good geology report that said there are no strategic minerals in the Ukraine. Nonetheless, President Trump said that there's about $350 billion worth of military expenditures from the past 3 years that need to be balanced. Zelensky said, it's only $100 billion. And it seems there's a component whereby the U.S. military will stay behind and be present in the Ukraine. I don't know how the Russians are going to feel about that. I don't know how the Russians see it right now. But that was something that came out in this discussion, that there is military, American military in the Ukraine, and that they may stay after the end of fighting takes place. But I would imagine that's not going to be liked too much by the Russians. But the Russian deputy UN ambassador in New York, Dmitry Polyansky, in a new interview reemphasized the positive, noting on the side of the Russians that President Trump is admitting openly that the NATO expansion to the east has been the main dynamic cause of the war in the Ukraine. And I think that's a very important matter, because Biden and crowd kept talking about the Russian invasion, the unprovoked Russian invasion. And now we have a president who's saying just the opposite. No, it was provoked. And all the lies that were told by the West to Russia that we will not move 1 inch closer to Russia with NATO. Well, unfortunately, not only in the United States and Russia, they that are concerned with settling and normalizing the relations between the U.S. and Russia, the two largest nuclear superpowers in the world, mind you, but unfortunately, there are some absolutely insane, crazy Europeans who are committed to keeping the war going. And the so-called coalition of the willing has formed between the British, the French, the Germans, the Baltics, and the Scandinavian countries. They're determined to keep feeding weapons into the Ukraine and keep the war going. And I think it's quite telling that Ambrose Evans Pritchard, a very known and dubious journalist, if you can call him that, might be an intelligence spook, because he said he was full of praise for the deal. And the U.S.-Ukraine raw materials deal, he just thought that was great. He said it was a fantastic thing. Because if the war in Ukraine keeps going one more year, he said the Russian economy will collapse for sure. So you can see the intention of those people who are in this coalition of the willing. They don't want peace. They want to keep the war going. And they have not given up on their aim to ruin Russia, possibly even split Russia up into many pieces, which would bring us to the absolute red line of nuclear war. Now we have the ongoing tariff war, in which Trump is going back and forth. I mean, one day in this direction, the next day in another direction. And this has the potential in the short term of triggering a complete blowout of the financial system. Obviously, Trump wants to reindustrialize the United States, and he wants to undo the excesses of the neoliberal model that's been used in the last decades. It's been bleeding us dry. But when he says tariffs will protect the U.S. economy, that was the case in the times of Alexander Hamilton, when he protected the brand new economy of the United States with tariffs. But it clearly does not apply, as we are seeing, for a very interconnected world economy where many products are being produced in several countries. You know, spare parts are produced in Canada and Mexico and Africa, in all kinds of places. So it could actually not only lead to an increase in consumer prices here in our country, but it could lead to the default of emerging markets and over-indebted American firms, and in that way it could trigger a collapse of the financial system. I'm not so sure that Trump has really thought this through far enough. And there's another element which is reported by the American military magazine Defense One. They say that given the fact that most of the rare earth elements are in China, but even more importantly, some of the industrial equipment to refine those raw materials are all in China, therefore they cannot be replaced in the short term by anybody else. And lo and behold, over 78% of all U.S. weapons need these Chinese rare earth elements from China. So maybe the U.S. has shot its own defense industry in the foot by imposing these tariffs. Now the Chinese are marshaling their economic troops to do what they can in response to this, because China probably depends on the United States more than we depend on China, in the sense that the majority of the things manufactured in China, or if not the majority, enough of a proportion of that manufacturing load is sold in America. And without America buying these things, the Chinese economy would collapse. So, moving on, the other absolutely horrendous situation on the planet is the ongoing genocide in Gaza. And I was able, well, not able, freely discussions with some of my colleagues down in San Diego this weekend over Gaza. Every single one of the people I talked to was aware of the genocide, was aware that America was playing a very heavy hand in the killing of these innocent people, and were as disturbed as I was about it. Now, since the 2nd of March, the Israeli government and the IDF have imposed a complete blockade on Gaza. No food, no medical assistance, ongoing fighting, pushing people back and forth. And in all conventions, it is stated that to use hunger as a weapon of war is a war crime. But it's part of the general genocide that's going on there. Obviously, genocide is a war crime. But there are war crimes that are being committed that are leading up to the ultimate war crime, the final extinction of the Palestinian people. And if you look at these hotspots, and there are 3 more hotspots I'm adding to this: the Congo, the Sudan, and Haiti. There are all these areas in the world which are just crying out for vengeance, crying out for help. And the dynamic, unfortunately, is towards getting worse, not better. So therefore, there is a need for an international mobilization to get a breakthrough. I mean, you can't just You can't just sit by. So, since the 70s, or maybe earlier than that, since the OASIS plan was first formulated and brought forward to turn the Middle East into a lush garden through massive nuclear-powered desalination plants, more and more countries, especially in the global south, have caught on to this and are promoting it. And given the fact that at the beginning of June, here in another month, there's this big UN conference in New York devoted to the two-state solution in the Middle East. Now, the UN historically does not have the power to do what it decides needs to be done. We know that. And the major force preventing the creation of a two-state solution right now in the Middle East isn't Israel, it's the United States. And the veto effort, the veto position that they hold in the UN Security Council. So even though all the other members of the UN Security Council have voted for and want to get going a two-state solution, it's the United States that ends up vetoing. So given the fact that in the beginning of June, as I said, there's going to be this big conference in the UN, the Egyptian government, I was thinking there for a second, the Egyptian government has forwarded this reconstruction plan for Gaza, which has been endorsed by the Arab League and the Arab countries, and it could incorporate a highly accelerated mobilization to put the OASIS plan on the agenda, along with the two-state solution in this UN conference. Because when you add economic development for the entire region, it's an absolute ingredient, not only to solve the Gaza situation, but to create the conditions for peace. You can't have peace just by stopping shooting the people on the other side of the fence. There has to be an economic system set up in its place that will benefit everybody. So in a certain sense, Pope Francis's final effort, just the day before he died, the Urbi et Orbi message that he gave, he recalled all the many sufferings in the world and all the people who'd been victimized by war from Palestine, Israel, Lebanon, the Congo, the Sudan, many others. He told all these people that he's praying for them, but he warned of the danger of a nuclear arms race and called on people to reject the logic of fear and war. He said people have to promote development instead, calling development the weapon of peace. So I don't think it's too far a notion that this conference that starts in a month in the UN might take into their agenda the endorsement of the OASIS plan, because it's a weapon of peace, which, well, saying that, I want to reiterate, as important as a regional solution the OASIS plan for the Middle East is, I believe that only if we ever overcome geopolitics, if we overcome the idea that one always needs an enemy, one always needs to have a zero-sum game where one wins and the other one loses, or for that matter, that's the right of one country or a group of countries to contain the rise of another country. I mean, realistically, I think the idea of containing the rise of China at this point in time is impossible. China right now is way ahead of the West. I talked about this last week, where the Australian, this policy institute in Australia, in their critical technology checkup, just reported that of what they enumerated as the 64 advanced technologies, China is leading in 57 of them. And in 10 areas of advanced technology, China is leading in 9 of them. And if you ever go to China, and I only have the testimony of some patients who've been there, my own family who's been there, you're going to see that they're way ahead in many areas. It's almost ludicrous. They have 1.5 billion people. We have a little more than 300 million. The European Union has 500 million. So it's time for this new paradigm of not peace through strength, not peace through domination, but peace through cooperation, especially as can be administered as a two-state solution for the Middle East. Now, I really think deeply of the Oasis plan, together with a two-state solution and the Egyptian plan for the reconstruction of Gaza, which is not Trump Riviera, would make a package which would not only have a great positive perspective for the Gaza, but would go beyond the status quo and go in the direction of making a real peace plan for the Middle East. So the vision of how the Middle East can be transformed and the desert turned into green is something that's really being pushed by young people in various countries who are coming together, realizing the impact that the Oasis plan would have. I mean, you can't have life without water. You look here in our own state. I don't know if you've seen it. I saw it last week, the drought map. And, you know, from the middle of the state down, it's horrible. Now, the whole state is in a drought. Some of it's manageable, but much of it isn't. And the highest distinction or the highest level of drought recognition is severe drought. And about 1/3 of the state, if not more than 1/3, is in a severe drought situation. And what would a tremendous amount of water do for these people? So when Governor Cox was having that meeting over signing whatever papers were necessary to open the way for the development of a nuclear power station in Utah for electric power, I mean, we don't have any salt water that we need to desalinate. But just a step in that direction to have nuclear power in Utah, which is clean power, especially this later generation stuff the French and the Chinese are developing. It's just, well, it fills my heart with a lot of hope. All right, now there's some other things I want to move on to here. And that is this, the Immortal Regiment March in Washington that just took place here Saturday. TASS covered it, and I'm getting this from TASS, the demonstration of the Immortal Regiment in Washington. And the Wire noted that this is the first time the demonstration has taken place since 2019. And the participation of members of the Commonwealth of Independent States, CIS, and other countries whose relatives had served in World War II. The Russian embassy expressed appreciation for the U.S. authorities to allow the march. So they said this: "We support the holding of the Immortal Regiment events in Washington and other American cities. It is good that the authorities have given permission for both a memorial event in honor of the meeting of Soviet American armies at the Elba at Arlington Cemetery, with the participation of officials, including representatives of the Diplomatic Corps and the State Department, for today's march, which is being held at the initiative of compatriots living in the United States." TASS's Russian language cover included comments by activist Bill Jones, identified as an American commentator and analyst with the LaRouche organization, and who participated in the march. And Jones expressed that the march clearly marked the reassertion of Russian culture and history in our nation's capital after so many years of constant attempts to limit the rights and even erase Russian culture and history. And Jones said, they are here again. There was a wonderful ceremony at the World War II Memorial with a small orchestra and Russian songs, Jones said, pointed to a group of protesters with Ukrainian symbols who wouldn't leave, but were largely reminding him of the pesky mosquitoes on a hot summer day. That before the protesters dispersed, they laid flowers at the bas-relief in honor of the meeting of Soviet and American troops at the Elbe River in Torgau, Germany, which happened after the Russians took Berlin. Now, with all this hoopla celebrating this conquest of Nazism, Zelensky's got some comments. So, Ukraine's acting president, Volodymyr Zelensky, amplified upon his previous threats of violence upon the gathering of world leaders in Moscow for the annual May 9 celebration, excuse me, of victory over the Nazis in World War II. Previously, Zelensky, while attacking Putin's three-day unilateral truce as a manipulation, says they are now concerned that their parade is in jeopardy, and rightly so. What they should worry about is that this war continues. So on Saturday, Zelensky told reporters, according to Interfax Ukraine, no one is going to help Putin play this in order to give him a soft atmosphere of escape from isolation on May 9. And to make everyone feel comfortable and safe, those leaders, friends, or partners of Putin who will come to Kremlin Square, we are either at war or Putin is showing that he's ready for a ceasefire. Poor man. So Kyiv's Center for Countering Disinformation, run out of Ukraine's Office of the President, essentially summarized Zelensky's threat by saying this: our position is very simple with regard to all the countries that are going to on May 9. We cannot be responsible for what happens on the territory of the Russian Federation. They are ensuring your safety, and therefore we will not give you any guarantees. Wow. Now, May 9, see, today's the 5th, 6, 7, 8, 9. That would be Saturday, Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. Friday would be May 9, and that's when the big celebration of the 80th anniversary of the end of World War II is going to take place. And this immortal regiment is made up of surviving soldiers, Marines, Airmen, Navy, whatever fought in that war. For the elimination of Nazism, who are still alive, and their relatives would be in this march, which has already occurred all around the world this last Saturday. Now, this Friday is the big celebration. And Zakharova, no, I'm getting ahead of myself. It's Zelensky, according to RT, said that he had instructed Ukraine's foreign ministry to advise against visiting Russia during this period. I wonder if they're going to be staging massive drone attacks. You know, the drones that have been getting through, you know what they're hitting? They're hitting Russian Orthodox churches. I suppose the Russian government didn't feel that it was necessary to have all of that. You know, most of the Russian anti-missile and anti-drone defensive systems, the S-400, the S-500 systems, are around strategic targets. So knowing that for every 20 drones the Ukrainians send across the border into Russia, 19 and a half of them are going to be shot down before they hit the target. It's that one that gets through, and the one that gets through has been hitting Russian churches, Orthodox churches. Anyway, the spokesperson for Russia's foreign ministry, Maria Zakharova, who I quote often, said that Zelensky's remarks, quote, once again prove the neo-Nazi nature of the Kyiv regime, which has turned into a terrorist cell. Today he hit a new low. Now he's threatening the physical safety of veterans who will come to parades and ceremonial events on that sacred day. After every terrorist attack on Russian territory, the Kyiv regime, its security services, and Zelensky's personally boast that it was their doing and that it will continue to be like this. Therefore, the phrase that he does not guarantee security on May 9 on Russian territory, since this is not his area of responsibility, is of course a direct threat, which is what I thought when I heard his comments. You better not be there. That's what he's saying. So the never reticent Dmitry Medvedev, who's the deputy chairman of the Security Council of Russia and former Russian president, posted on Telegram, he said this, who needs his guarantees? It's just a verbal provocation, nothing more. This scum understands that no one guarantees that Kyiv will see 10 May in the event of a real provocation on Victory Day. Now, I ran across this. I was surprised when I found this. But not surprisingly, President Trump's May 1 remarks attributing the victory of World War II solely to the U.S. role has caused widespread commentary in Russia from many sources, including the Duma. So it was reported on May 2nd that in response to a request from the Fontanka publishing house, Foreign Ministry spokeswoman Maria Zakharova provided 3 quotes from President Franklin Delano Roosevelt, in which he forcefully praised the Soviet role in the war. And Zakharova was chiding Trump for rewriting history. When I heard that the other day, I had hoped that it was a Saturday Night Live comedy routine. But no, Trump was serious. He said it was America and American allies that won World War II. So her first quote was from FDR's April 28, 1942 fireside chat, in which he said this, on the European front, the most important event of the past year has undoubtedly been the crushing counteroffensive of the great Russian army against the powerful German group. Russian troops have destroyed and continue to destroy more manpower, aircraft, tanks, and guns of our common enemy than all the other United Nations put together. Then her second reference was to a February 4th, 1943 letter that Roosevelt wrote to Joseph Stalin, who of course was the supreme commander of the Allied forces of the Soviet Union. Roosevelt congratulated him on the victory in the Battle of Stalingrad. Zakharova only paraphrased its content, in which Roosevelt acknowledged that the Soviet victory and the heroism of the Soviet people inspired the Allies to fight with determination to defeat the enemy. So in the full text of FDR's letter, quote, the 162 days of epic battle for the city, which has forever honored your name, and the decisive result, which all Americans are celebrating today, will remain one of the proudest chapters in this war of the peoples united against Nazism and its emulators. The commanders and fighters of your armies at the front, and the men and women who have supported them in factory and field, have combined not only to cover with glory their country's arms, but to inspire by their example fresh determination among all the United Nations to bend every energy to bring about the final defeat and the unconditional surrender of the common enemy. Then Zakharova reported on FDR's February 22, 1943 letter to Stalin on the 25th anniversary of the Red Army. And in the first part of the letter, which she didn't quote, FDR said, "At the immortal Battle of Stalingrad, the Red Army not only defeated the enemy, but launched the great offensive, which is still moving forward along the whole front from the Baltic to the Black Sea. The enforced retreat of the enemy is costing him heavily in men, supplies, territory, and especially in morale." Then Zakharova did quote the very last part of the letter that said, "The Red Army and the Russian people certainly forced Adolf Hitler's armed forces to follow the path to final defeat and won the admiration and the people of the United States for a long time." Well, there is extensive commentary from foreign journalists on this very hot topic, particularly on the date of May 9 is approaching this Friday, on which Russia will be commemorating in Moscow the defeat of Nazism and the end of the Great Patriotic War. And there are a lot of representatives from the United States who the left wing in our government is not very happy with. But then it's the left wing in our government in combination with the right wing that continue to support Nazism in the Ukraine for the last several years. And I've reported on that extensively. So that's, and then in the midst of this, Zelensky is warning people, don't go there. Don't be there. Don't be in that area. All right, now I was going to say something about what happened at Swarthmore College, where more people are being arrested for not keeping their mouths shut. But what I want to move on to, I'm just looking at the rest of my notes here. The Times of Israel. This is really terrible. Israel's, this ongoing barbarous policy against Gaza is causing Palestinian people to become increasingly desperate as a result of the extreme privations that has been imposed on them because of this conflict. So since Wednesday, April 30, both armed and unarmed people have been looting UN and aid groups' warehouses, as well as bakeries and shops, all driven by the rumors that they held food supplies, according to a report in the Associated Press. Although there have been incidents of looting by armed gangs throughout the war, aid workers say this week's looting marks an escalation as it was less organized and reached out into the urban areas. So according to the Times of Israel, a very left-wing paper, humanitarian groups on May 2nd described scenes of starvation and fights over water in Gaza, warning that the aid operations are on the brink of total collapse. The, quote, "The humanitarian response in Gaza is on the verge of total collapse," the International Committee of the Red Cross has warned. Without immediate action, Gaza will descend further into chaos that humanitarian efforts might not be able to mitigate. So the Norwegian Refugees Council's humanitarian access manager to Gaza said this: "Thousands of people are going to die if nothing is done, as other aid agencies are calling for urgent international action. Food stocks are largely empty." Olga Charovka, who's a spokeswoman for the UN humanitarian agency OCHA, told reporters in Geneva on May 2nd that water access has become impossible. "There's a water truck that has just arrived and people are killing each other over the water," she said. The fellow from the Norwegian Refugee Council said, an increase in needs-based looting across Gaza, and condemned what he said was a manufactured breakdown of civil order. Israel is not only preventing food from entering Gaza, but it's also engineered a situation in which Palestinians cannot grow their own food. They cannot fish for their own food, and they continue to attack or deny access to the little food stocks that are left in Gaza. Just absolutely horrible, and yet this continues. All right, now, We're almost done with the first hour. Did you happen, by any chance, was it Friday, Stephen Miller in the press conference in the White House went on for 30 minutes? Holy smoke. By the time he got done, I wanted to stand up and sing the American anthem and pledge allegiance. I had never heard such an erudite, concise explanation of the rot that has grown up in this country and what needs to be done about it. And he didn't pull any punches. And now with Waltz out as National Security Advisor, they're talking about putting Stephen Miller in there. So he could land the position as President Trump's next National Security Advisor, according to Axios. Now, Miller is one of Trump's longest and most trusted aides. And if you can't put a face to him, he's got short black hair with the really bald, large forehead, and no nonsense, no pulling of punches, no joking, although he does occasionally smile, but not very often. But he's been a spokesperson for Trump for a long time. And he was critical during the campaign last year. And so he has now emerged as the leading contender for National Security Advisor following Mike Waltz's removal from the role. Now, Waltz, who has taken considerable heat for the mainstream media of his role in Signalgate, which he should be taking heat, was nominated for U.S. Ambassador to the United Nations just hours after his removal as National Security Advisor. And Secretary of State Rubio is currently serving as the interim National Security Advisor. So Axios said this. One White House source told Axios via text that Miller has made the Homeland Security Council run like clockwork, and that it's infinitely more effective than the National Security Council with only a tiny fraction of the staff. Marco and Stephen have worked really close on immigration, and it might be a perfect match. So it remains uncertain at this point whether Stephen Miller would pursue the National Security Advisor role, but it could because it would divert him away from the immigration role that he's been playing. Now, Politico also reports that Witikoff, who's Trump's special envoy, was special envoy to Russia, but now he's kind of the envoy to the planet Earth, who's currently spearheading some critical negotiations with Russia, Iran, Hamas, is a contender for the National Security Advisor position himself. So, and additionally, the National Security Commission Senior Director for Counterterrorism, Gorka, you've heard him, and Trump's special envoy for special missions, Richard Grenell, are all generating buzz as possible candidates for the National Security Advisor. And when Politico asked about the impending announcement, White House spokesperson Caroline Leavitt said, "We will not comment on reports based on anonymous sources." I don't know why not. The Biden administration certainly did. So when Politico asked about the impending announcement, White House Caroline Leavitt said, "Hold on, just hold on." So Miller is the more likely candidate. He's utterly loyal to Trump's agenda, and probably one of the few people that Trump actually trusts in his administration. And Miller, for the NSA, is going over very well with Trump's base. Now, this is from the One American News at OANN. General Flynn and Matt Gaetz agree Stephen Miller could absolutely perform as National Security Advisor. Former National Security Advisor and New York Times bestselling author General Flynn tells Matt Gaetz Stephen Miller could absolutely do the job. He could be the National Security Advisor. he's got what it takes. This is from Tom Linton. Stephen Miller is the best spokesman for Trump administration and against the corruption of the deep state. Stephen Miller as NSA is great as long as he can continue to do both. So some want him to stay in immigration, of course, with with an equally good choice. This is another thing on X. Yes, Stephen Miller would make an excellent NSA, but he is hugely effective where he is, and where he is currently needed. General Flynn would be good for top position in the NSA. So as to Witkoff, another person Trump has trust in, Trump's very happy with him being a roving special envoy who can count on accurate messaging to other governments such as Russia and for honest appraisals of how the administration's policies are being received. So as a result, Witkoff has been and is now very welcomed in Russia, all without the shackles of needing congressional approval. So Miller was born August 23rd, 1985 in Santa Monica, California, where he was raised the second of three children in the Jewish family of Michael Miller, who was a real estate investor, and his mother's ancestors, Louis Glosser, Glosser, originally named Wolf Lieb Glosser, and his wife Bessie emigrated to the United States from the Russian Empire's Antipole in what is present-day Belarus, escaping the 1903-1906 anti-Jewish pogroms in Belarus and other parts of the Russian Empire. And when his great-grandmother arrived in the U.S. in 1906, she only spoke Yiddish, which is the historical language of the Ashkenazi Jews of Eastern Europe. And Miller's uncle recalls that when the grandfather reached Ellis Island on January 7th, 1903, with $8 to his name, even though he was fluent in Polish and Russian and Yiddish, he understood no English whatsoever. Then they ended up in California, and then that's where Stephen Miller was born. And I'll tell you, if Stephen Miller isn't as loyal an American as you can find, I'd be very, very surprised. But he may very well, before this week is over with, become Trump's next national security advisor. All right, now we are at the top of the hour. I think K-Talk will be going to a break. I'm not sure. But there's some other things I want to get to. Yeah, I know. My cat is anxious. I want a couple of comments here on how the White House is covering up the U.S. casualties in the Yemen war. President Trump is facing some growing scrutiny for withholding information about the U.S. military casualties that are resulting from the ongoing illegal military campaign in Yemen. Why do I say illegal? Because the Congress has not declared war on Yemen. Now, according to a report by The Intercept that was published on 3rd of May, U.S. Central Command, CENTCOM, the Office of the Secretary of Defense, and the White House have all refused to disclose how many U.S. service members have been killed or wounded since the launch of Operation Rough Rider in March of 2025. And the operation has involved over 1,000 U.S. airstrikes against the Ansarallah-led Yemeni armed forces and killed hundreds of Yemenis including, to a large degree, private civilians who are not in the service of fighting. So Representative Ro Khanna, you've seen her in the news a bit, from California, was criticizing the White House, calling for full disclosure. She said, "The administration should be transparent about the number of U.S. casualties from the attacks on the Houthis." He said, referring to Ansarallah. His colleague, Representative Paramila Jayapal of Washington, echoed the sentiment, warning that U.S. forces should never have been put in harm's way through unconstitutional military action lacking congressional approval. Now, I don't know why a president today would bother with the Constitution, since presidents since the days of the Korean War haven't bothered following constitutional rule on the declaration of war. They just say, well, it's not a war. It's just, it's a police action. It's, well, we're doing our part with the the United Nations. We're upholding our treaty with the United Nations to send in troops to help mitigate this ongoing situation that's not really a war. And because it's not really a war, we don't need congressional approval. So one recent incident underscored the risks of this. An FA-18 Super Hornet fighter, you've probably heard about this, the jet fell off the USS Harry Truman aircraft carrier earlier this week after the ship reportedly made a sharp turn to avoid a Yemeni missile. One sailor was injured, and the $60 million jet flew right over the side of the ship or the aircraft carrier into the water. And it was because of the super fast turn that the aircraft carrier was making that an unbalanced or loose, whatever, F-18 Hornet, Super Hornet, goes sailing off the side of the aircraft carrier into the ocean. Now think about that for a minute. In order to miss a missile, and how fast is that missile flying? How far away did they detect that missile? Is it one of those missiles that just shoot across the top of the water so it's hard to find at first? Is it a missile that's high in the sky so it's easy to detect? How fast can you turn an aircraft carrier? You ever been on a cruise? Some of those big cruise ships? I forget the name of it, but the last Caribbean cruise I've been on, Icon of the Sea or something, I think it was the biggest ship in the water at the time, as far as cruise ships are concerned. And I think its displacement was somewhere near what an aircraft carrier. I remember they were comparing it to an aircraft carrier. And in order to facilitate quick turns, they have these motors, instead of just having these shafts leading to propellers sticking out the rear end of the boat, or in this case the ship. That's not a boat, it's a ship. And a rudder. They got these two propellers sticking out the back of the boat with a rudder in the middle of the two. That's how aircraft carriers move, and big destroyers and whatever. But these cruise ships have these new electric propellers. So they have giant diesel generators in the hold of the cruise ships, just like the locomotives that run around, carry our railway cars up and down and back and forth across our country. Even though there's diesel engines, it's not the diesel engine that's running the train. The diesel engine is running the electric motors that run the train. And the same thing with some of these new big cruise ships. And so they have these propellers on these spindles that can rotate in different directions so that these big cruise ships could actually turn a 360-degree circle without moving right or left or up or down or back or whatever. They could just sit still and do a 360 cruise. These aircraft carriers can't do that. And so, I have never been on an aircraft carrier at sea. I haven't seen, therefore, an F-18 Super Hornet sitting on the deck of the aircraft carrier, though one would think that these airplanes would have blocks before and after the wheels on these aircraft carriers, if they weren't down a layer inside the boat. And so the story is they detect a missile that's coming towards the aircraft carrier, and the aircraft carrier executes this very fast turn. Now, these aircraft carriers, these missiles that the Houthis are sending against the American aircraft carrier, these aren't homemade backyard bottle rockets. These are coming in from other countries. They're very sophisticated. And it didn't say whether it was hypersonic or not, because if it's hypersonic, you're wasting your time trying to duck it. But these missiles are not bottle rockets. They have targeting equipment in the front of these missiles. They look for dense objects like the hull, the steel hull of a ship. And so when I read that the ship is turning a really quite right turn starboard or something to avoid a missile, and how long are these aircraft carriers? Just get this idea in your mind. They're long enough for a catapult launch of these sophisticated aircraft like the Super Hornet, the F-18 Super Hornet, or the F-35s. But how big, how long are these aircraft carriers? And if it's turning to avoid a missile, is it just turning a couple of degrees to dodge an oncoming head-on missile? Or is it turning to the right or the left to get out of the way of a missile that could hit midships? I'm just trying, for the benefit of my president, my government, my Navy, military, for their benefit, I'm trying to create an image in my mind where I can harmoniously believe that you could turn an aircraft carrier fast enough to miss an incoming missile. And you remember the story about the SR-71, the Blackbird? When it's flying at full speed, it takes 4 states for it to turn around 180 degrees. If it was flying west at 60,000 feet over Nebraska, by the time it could execute a complete 180-degree turn back the other direction, it will have come down over Wyoming, Utah, Arizona, New Mexico, before it is pointing back the other direction. Now, its speed has an awful lot to do with that, of course. But it can't just turn on a dime like an F-16 practically can, or some of these airplanes that are involved with the Blue Angels and whatever else. Some of them have certain aerobatic design to them. I know I'm dragging this out. I know I'm harping on this. But they said because the aircraft carrier tried to execute a sharp turn, the plane fell off the side of the aircraft carrier. And I think the plane was shot to pieces by the Houthis. And they're just telling the story to try and cover it up. And if the Houthis are capable of shooting an F-18 Super Hornet out of the air, then we've got problems. So that plane cost $60 million, flopping off the side of the aircraft carrier into the ocean. Now, when The Intercept asked the Pentagon for casualty figures, officials deflected, of course, and directed the inquiry to CENTCOM. CENTCOM then referred the request to the White House, which has been very silent. And under the previous administration of Joe Biden, the detailed casualty and attack data from across West Asia was regularly released. The contrast has alarmed advocacy groups. Eric Sperling of Just Foreign Policy said, withholding basic information from the public makes it harder for the media to shine light on how these officials are violating one of Trump's most broadly popular campaign promises. Well, one of the main promises of Trump in all of his stops across the country when he was campaigning for the office was to end the wars. First thing I'm going to do is end the wars. Well, we're still sending armament to the Ukraine. And we're still sending armament to Israel. So the genocidal destruction continues. Now, The Intercept reported, it followed an order by the Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth, on the 2nd of May for the USS Harry Truman aircraft carrier to remain in West Asia for another week, marking the second time its deployment has been extended amid this ongoing military operation against Yemen. And meanwhile, Trump's former national security advisor, Waltz, was dismissed this week, in part of including a journalist in sensitive discussions about the Yemen strikes. Waltz also was punished for greater military action against Iran and reportedly coordinated closely with Israeli Prime Minister Netanyahu, actions that clash with Trump's more cautious approach, according to administration services. So, U.S. forces, in my opinion, should never have been put in harm's way through the unconstitutional military action lacking congressional approval. No one should be put in harm's way. Putting people in harm's way, of course, is the American way. Our country has been doing it for so long, I don't even think they know anything different. The only thing it's going to understand, though, is when those body bags start coming back, and then the sad thing is it's going to be some poor patriotic family who thought their son or daughter was doing the right thing and died needlessly. So sad, really. The only time you need a military is when you go to war. But America has turned war into some kind of an obscene sport, like the Super Bowl, but with weapons of mass destruction. I really don't know how much longer this can go on. All right, I also want to talk about something you're going to find interesting. Just as a breakaway from death and destruction. A top NASA official, this is in the Daily Mail, a top NASA official breaks a 30-year silence to reveal sensational UFO footage of a giant flying saucer secretly created by the U.S. Air Force. Dr. Gregory Rogers, he's a former NASA flight surgeon and an Air Force major. And this alleged UFO footage, I've seen it, and declassified CIA files on alien encounters are just flooding the internet atmosphere right now. And one NASA top official has revealed exclusively to the Daily Mail that the U.S. Air Force possesses a 20-foot gravity-defying flying saucer, and he claims that he saw footage of it flying more than 30 years ago. Now that's only 1995. Now the former NASA chief surgeon and Air Force major, you want to listen to this, Dr. Gregory Rogers, who worked with astronauts on several space missions, says he was shown security footage by another Air Force major in 1992 depicting the exotic aircraft levitating inside of a hangar. And he kept the secret for more than 32 years, but following his retirement from the Department of Defense, he's decided to come forward. Now, Rogers, who is 68, said he wanted to back up another recent Department of Defense whistleblowers who have told Congress that the military is in fact in possession of this out-of-this-world spacecraft that was reverse engineered from alien technology. He said this to the Daily Mail: "I know exactly what I saw that day, and it was in no fashion a conventional flying vehicle. I have heard members of Congress express their desire to hear more of the experiences of any additional whistleblowers. Therefore, I'm presenting my story. I hope that my report stimulates others to reveal what they have similarly witnessed." So former NASA flight surgeon, Air Force Major Dr. Gregory Rogers says he was taken into a room by an Air Force major and shown classified footage of a UFO with U.S. insignia on the UFO. Now, this is back in 1992. We didn't have Photoshop. But the flying saucer that Rogers saw, he says, was 20 feet wide, probably 8 to 10 feet tall, and it had a shallow dome on top of it. And in the late spring of 1992, Rogers was stationed at the NASA facility in Cape Canaveral, Florida. And it was the heyday of America's space program, a busy time of regular launches and high-profile space shuttle missions. And he kept the secret for more than 32 years. But following his retirement from the Department of Defense last month, he decided to come forward. So as chief flight surgeon, he was responsible for the safety inspections on the base and the medical care for its personnel, including the astronauts. This sometimes involved jumping into a helicopter and fishing them out of the ocean after their capsules splashed back down to the Earth. So one afternoon around April or May of 1992, he was about to go home after inspecting a facility on the base where satellite components were assembled. And when a U.S. Air Force major approached him in the corridor, and this Air Force major came up to Dr. Rogers and said, "Hey, Doc, I got something for you. It'll knock your socks off." Now, Rogers later said he didn't recognize the man, but Rogers' job involved caring for hundreds of patients, so he said it was not unusual to be approached by servicemen who he knew but whom he had forgotten. And the major ushered him into a room with computers, locked the door, and then closed the blinds. And Rogers said, "I'm thinking at this time, what's this man doing?" He sits down at the computer console. It takes several minutes, and then all of a sudden, up on the screen comes this closed-circuit television feed. And what I'm looking at here looks like a flying saucer. I mean, it's very dirty. So he said the ship had no apparent antennas or flight control surfaces, had about 4 horizontal rectangles spaced evenly around the middle. He said he didn't recognize the Air Force major who showed him the footage against his will that day, but said that he was a wimpy guy who most likely wanted to show off his importance. So at the NASA facility in Cape Canaveral, where he viewed the footage, he was the chief flight surgeon in charge of safety inspections on the base, as well as medical care for its personnel, including the astronauts. So he said the footage showed a standard aircraft hangar, just like the one that housed Rogers' chopper for his work with the 41st Air Rescue Squadron. He said, except it's not my helicopter. He said, it's a flying saucer. He said, I would estimate it was about 20 feet wide, probably 8 to 10 feet tall. It had a shallow dome on top of it. There were no antennas. There were no flight control surfaces. Everything was very smooth and blended, and I saw no rivets, no seams, nothing. There was a little area on top which had a stick coming out of it. At the top of it were umbilical hoses, like if you were feeding gases or electricity into it. Everything was white. There was a vertical black triangle at 3 o'clock, 6 o'clock, and 9 o'clock positions on the upper half of the vehicle. He said there were also 4 horizontal rectangles spaced evenly around the middle. My mind was going crazy, he said. A flying saucer, are you kidding me? He said the footage showed a standard aircraft hangar, just like the one that housed Rogers' helicopter for his work with the 41st Air Rescue Squadron. Rogers said that the most jaw-dropping part of the footage was when the ship hovered, remained stationary, and then made a 45-degree tilt, suggesting it had some unknown propulsion technology. You think? The ex-NASA doctor said the footage showed several men, some in lab coats, some in hazmat-type bodysuits, that were busy around the vehicle. Then on the audio feed, he heard a loud horn-like sound, and the technicians moved out of the camera. What happened next surprised him, he said. I hear and see these things that look like electromagnetic charges coming off this vehicle, but there's no devices from which they're emanating. Then all of a sudden it just lifted up as smooth as could be. Once it got up maybe 3 feet above the concrete surface, it rotated completely around clockwise, 1 revolution, then it revolved counterclockwise, 1 revolution. The rotation revealed writing on one side. It said U.S. Air Force, and it had the U.S. flying insignia. And he said, I'm thinking, is this one of ours? Then he had this 2004 video showing the Navy pilot tracking a UFO over the Pacific. He said there were 2 eerie UFOs that had been caught on a U.S. Naval Academy, a U.S. Navy camera, emerging from the ocean and taking off in a synchronized flight along the coast of Southern California. The above was captured in 2023 that I'm looking at. At some point, he said, I asked the guy, why on earth would we design something like this? He said, we got it from them. He said, pointing his thumb in the direction of the sky, which I interpreted as meaning from space. Then something really caught my attention, he says. Rogers said that the entire craft tipped sideways 45 degrees, but remained stationary, hovering in the air. He said this one maneuver shocked him the most because it showed the craft used some unknown propulsion technology. If a helicopter tips forward while hovering, the thrust from its propellers would force it to move forward. Some military fixed-wing aircraft like the F-35B can take off vertically, but only by using large exterior jets pointed towards the ground, and it would require other jets on its side to stay in place while tipping forward. Rogers, who's an experienced Air Force pilot, said there was no sign of any such jets on this smooth, white saucer. That blew me away because none of the aircraft we have can do that. So just after the saucer on the video performed its 45-degree tilt, Rogers said there was a knock at his door. Excuse me, lost my spot. Just after the saucer on the video performed its 45-degree tilt, Rogers said there was a knock at the door. Somebody was saying, "Hey, what's going on in there? Why is the door locked?" The moment that happened, the major turns off everything, Rogers says. Then he leans over to me in a very serious voice and says, "Don't tell anybody I showed this to you." He opens the door, and this lieutenant colonel and two other guys in blue U.S. Air Force suits walk in. The major said, I have a skin lesion, and I just wanted the doctor to see if it's okay." He said, "My mind was racing. I've seen something classified that was shown to me illegally. I just think I've got to get out of here." So I said, "Yeah, it wasn't cancer. It's okay, but I've got to get back to my clinic." Rogers said he hadn't told his wife about what he had seen for 15 years and that he was breaking his silence publicly due to the influx of disclosures that have come out recently on UAPs. Rogers said he never spoke to the major or visited that facility again, and to this day does not know why the U.S. Air Force officer chose to show him the shocking video. So on his way home from Cape Canaveral down to Patrick Air Force Base, about 25 or 30 minutes, the whole time I'm thinking, there is no way on earth I can tell anyone that I just saw a flying saucer. This guy trapped me by showing me something I didn't want to see. But there was not a thing I could do about it. I absolutely resent being a part of the events of that day. I didn't even tell my wife for 15 years. Rogers said he never spoke to the major or visited that facility again, and to this day does not know why the U.S. Air Force officer chose to show him the shocking video. He said, "My personal opinion is that he was trying to say, look, I'm important." He seemed like a really wimpy guy. The doctor pilot was used to keep military secrets, having flown clandestine missions behind Soviet lines from a base in West Germany during the Cold War in the mid-1980s. But he also has experience blowing the whistle on powerful government institutions. And during testing of the space shuttles used for NASA's STS missions in the 1990s, it became clear that thermal protection tiles on the orbiter's wings were vulnerable to damage during its ascent. So during his Air Force career, Rogers flew clandestine missions behind Soviet lines from a base in West Germany during the Cold War. The 2003 explosion of the Columbia Space Shuttle, which caused the death of all 7 crew members on board, he said this could cause a deadly disaster during a fiery process of re-entering the Earth's atmosphere on its return. In his safety role, Rogers says he repeatedly pleaded with NASA leadership to put a repair kit on board, allowing astronauts to repair any damage in space before they return home. He even wrote the 1995 novel Impact, about a fictional NASA crew facing this threat. But he says he was ignored until disaster struck on February 1st, 2003, when that exact issue caused the explosion of the Columbia Space Shuttle and the death of its 7 crew members. He said people knew that the danger I spoke of in '95 was real. They still decided we're not going to do anything about it. It's too politically charged. Says Rogers sees the same pattern with UFOs, saying leaders are in denial about what the government calls unidentified anomalous phenomena, the UAPs, which is kind of the new designation now. It's the same mentality, he said. We are having videos from FA-18s, that's the Super Hornet, and from other governmental sources that are showing these things are there. We don't have to debate it anymore. Are UAPs real? We know they're real. Rogers' recommendation later from NASA, he said some of the astronauts he's befriended during his time at NASA told him they saw UFOs accompanying their aircraft flying through space. Which brings me to something that I remember from one of the earliest moon missions. It was before Apollo 11, the moon landing. There were, as you remember, 2, 3, maybe 4 orbits of the moon before they finally, allegedly, had Armstrong on the surface, along with Buzz Aldrin. There is downtown in Washington on Maryland and C Street, NASA headquarters. And my father worked there. It's an interesting story. His life from being wounded in World War II and the things that he went through as a result of that, and eventually ending up at NASA headquarters in Washington, D.C. My mother was working out at Goddard Space Flight in Maryland at the same time he was working for NASA downtown Washington. And there is a room in, I think it's on the 5th floor, if I remember right, in NASA headquarters, called the Mission Status Room. And in this Mission Status Room, there are these TV screens up in front of the room, big screens. For 1967, 1968, these were big screens. And this room was open only to special invitation, usually involving members of Congress or people who were high up in the various departments of the executive branch or legislative branch, who may not be an elected official but had enough bearing on governmental policies that they, at time, would be invited into this room to witness things involving space flights that you would not see on national television. And I remember on one occasion, I don't remember which moon flight it was, but my dad let me go. And it must have been during a break or during the summer that he would let me out of school. And I went to, there were times I would go to work with him during the summer break. And while he was in his office, I'd be out on the mall going to Smithsonian or to the Medical Museum, the Air and Space Museum, the Archives Building, the Library of Congress. I just found my time well spent during summer breaks downtown with my dad, visiting these things. And he'd give me enough money to go buy lunch at the cafeteria in the Smithsonian, where they served swordfish steak. That's where I discovered swordfish. Swordfish steak prepared correctly is absolutely delicious, but that's another story. So on this one occasion, I am in the Mission Status Room. And off to the side of the Mission Status Room is another room that controls what's being shown on those big screens, of which there's probably, I don't know, 100, 150 chairs, folding chairs that are there for people to come and observe what's going on. And this was on the occasion of one of the moon flights. And as I said, I can't remember which one it was. And they were showing on the screen up in front, the big screens, exactly what was being shown on national television. Clips, live clips from where the fellows in the capsule orbiting the moon, you could see some shots of the moon surface, you could see some shots of space itself, depending on which direction the cameras were pointing. And I was in the room that controlled what the big room saw, because my dad turned me over to one of his friends and said, do you mind if my son observes what's going on? Oh, no, come on in, Jack Jr., something like that. he took me into the room, just stand over there, stay out of the way, and watch what's going on. And I was probably 16, maybe 15, but maybe 16 when this is going on. And you heard the commander in the lunar module, of which there's 3 of them, orbiting the moon. Now, I told you all of that to tell you this. There was a moment of silence, and Houston is talking to the module, trying to contact the commander, because there was a pause in the commander's response to Houston's question. And the commander says, "There they are again." And some of the people in the larger room heard that. Some of the rest of them are all talking and chatting among themselves. But the people in the control booth heard it. There they are again. And some fellow reached over in front of me and flipped a switch that immediately took the big screens in the bigger room to national broadcast, which happened to be One Life to Live, or it was some soap opera that was being shown simultaneously on national television, early afternoon soap opera. But in the control room, the fellow said, "There are 3 objects out my left window in a triangle pattern, pacing themselves with us." Now, I heard that. I didn't see it. They didn't show us what they were looking at or what they could see, but I heard that. And I haven't mentioned that very often. And my dad wasn't in the room. He was out talking to somebody out in the other room. And I asked him about that later on. He just said, "Oh, yeah? Is that what?" "Oh, yeah?" I said, Dad? Oh, yeah?" So that was, they knew about this in the 60s, the 1960s. But we've had crashed aircraft. The Russians, we know, had a crashed aircraft in the 1930s, the Soviets. And they started working in reverse engineering of a crashed extraterrestrial vehicle, or these UAPs now, unidentified aerial phenomena. I don't know why they had to change the name, but they did. And I kind of forgot that experience about my dad until I was reading this article. I said, "Oh gosh, I haven't talked about that in a long time." And my father, unfortunately, passed away here about 3 years ago, next month. And I would like to have talked to him about that again, but I know what he would have said. "Oh, yeah?" So then, of course, there is Trinity, the crashed space aircraft, the crashed UAP at Trinity. You know, Trinity is where the first test explosion of the atomic bomb in New Mexico took place. There's the Trinity craft, and we know now, because of whistleblowers coming out, that there was a craft that crashed even before the Trinity craft in 1945, which occurred, I think if I remember right, 2 weeks before the test explosion. Because these aircraft were hovering, mostly at night, over the test center, Trinity Test Center, for the first nuclear explosion. And I guess rightly so, they would be worried about these things because it brings in visions of the day the Earth stood still, the old Michael Rennie version of the 1950s. So with the Jacques Vallée wrote a book called Trinity. In fact, I've got it on my bookshelf over here off to the side. That's very fascinating because the kind of stuff it talks about is just almost unbelievable that the government saw and knew 2 weeks before the first Trinity explosion. And there have been downed spacecraft from time to time, some of which we have shot down. I don't know why we would be doing that. And now we know, not only have there been these aircraft identified, unidentified aerial phenomena, and I think one of the reasons why they changed from UFO to UAP is because they don't always look like a flying object. Although they're up in the air moving around, some of them are globes. Some of them are globes with a cube inside the globe. Some of them are just little tiny wisps of light that follow something else. Do I believe that? Of course I believe it. The evidence is overwhelming. And that these things have been around for a long, long time. I've often told the story of what happened between me and Tom Drashel once. When I first got married there in '72, and I was working for Constitution Mint, a silver mint, there on Columbia Street, or Columbia Road there, just a little bit west of 5th West in Provo, right there on the banks of the Provo River. And we produced silver bullion and silver medallions and blank planchettes that were sent out to other stamping presses. And I overheard a conversation that was going on in the front office about a place up Spanish Fork Canyon where if you go to this right place at the right time, you can see up on a far high peak, this rotating blue and orange light. Well, I told Tom about it. Now, this is long before K-Talk. Tom and I and Dick, the owner of K-Talk, grew up together back in Northern Virginia. And we all ended up out at BYU. And then we all ended up getting married and living out there till Tom took off to Texas. But I told Tom what these guys had said. I overheard their conversation. And I said, let's go see this. And he said, yeah, let's go see this. So we took off one night. And it was in the dead of winter. It was very, very cold. And I don't remember whose car we used. But we drove up Spanish Fork Canyon to one fork after another fork after another fork, which I think I was following the directions correctly. And we got to this one spot and we parked the car and we got out, shivering a bit, but leaning up against the car, looking up on this mountainside. And I think there were some trees or something in the way, and we walked away from the car probably 200 or 300 feet. And it was so cold, you could hear the snow crunch. Not just crunch, but the squeaky sound of super cold snow under your feet. And we walked over there and stared up at this hillside, probably a good half hour, 45 minutes. And it's like midnight, 12:30, maybe approaching 1 o'clock in the morning. And we didn't see anything. We said, we're freezing to death, let's go home. So we started walking back towards the car, and a beautiful, clear sky night. And for some reason, we were both looking up at the same time. And I saw this light moving across the sky that had no flashing lights with it, that would signify commercial or military aircraft. And of course, some military aircraft is not recognizable in that sense at all. You've got to have other equipment to see it. And so I see this light, and it's moving in the same direction we're walking, only a bit faster. and all of a sudden it does an absolute 95-degree turn to the right. It's not one of these long multi-state turns that the SR-71 did. It was like it was an instantaneous, violating every law of physics, and I was taking physics at BYU at the time, violating any law of physics I know of, for it to stop and turn its direction that fast. And I didn't say anything. We just kept walking. And after about, I don't know, 30 seconds, not quite a minute, I turned to Tom and I said, "Tom, did you see what I just saw?" And he said, "What did you see?" And I told him. And he said, "Yeah, I saw that." And there weren't any orange and blue lights flashing or anything like that. I never went back up there again, at least not in the cold. It was very cold up there that night. And that's the first time I ever saw anything like that. Now, I've seen things out in the Great Basin since then that I would list as a UAP, an unidentified aerial phenomena, because they, again, were exhibiting novelistic motion that, according to my understanding of the law of inertia, is impossible. But somehow these aircraft overcome that kind of stuff. So we don't have to debate anymore whether these UAPs are real. We know they're real. Now, Roger's recommendation letter from NASA, he said some of the astronauts that he had befriended during his time at NASA said, as I talked about before I got out in the weeds here, that they had seen UFOs accompanying their aircraft when they're flying through space. And they said the only thing keeping the government from admitting that is sheer stubbornness at the upper levels. And he says, this gets me as mad as it does the NASA engineers. Through the publication of his 1995 book, he became friendly with astronaut Buzz Aldrin, the second man to walk on the moon. He also worked with several other spacewalkers at NASA, and Rogers said some whom he declined to name told him they saw various UFOs accompanying their craft flying through space. And he said, astronauts have discussed UAPs with me, vehicles that were not part of the human space program, as far as we know, being in or near the location of the spacecraft, flying between the Earth and the Moon. Even flying in formation with them is not uncommon, which is what I heard back in 1967 in the mission status room at NASA headquarters. 3 of them flying in formation. He said these incidents occurred during International Space Station missions, space shuttle missions, and missions to and from the moon. But he said the stigma around UFOs prevented him from naming names. He said if you're in the astronaut corps and you want to fly on the next mission, you're not going to improve your odds by saying something. Oh yeah, the last time I was up there, I saw a flying saucer. You're not going to be on the next mission if you say stuff like that. So Rogers says the existence of an Air Force flying saucer program, evidenced by this alleged CCTV footage that he saw, shows that some in the military are simply lying to lawmakers. Well, of course, that's the nature of their work. Said someone had to design and manufacture the vehicle I saw in that video. Someone, somewhere, had to pay for the research and the development of that vehicle. He said, I believe that this monetary expenditure should be identified to Congress since they hold the power of the purse over all military spending. Rogers said that he was not a UFO enthusiast before his chance experience and recent testimony by whistleblowers, but now in his retirement, he's joined the board of an Oklahoma-based charity, International UFO Bureau, and is helping witnesses to come forward to talk about their alleged encounters. So this group, funded in 1957, says it's the oldest UFO organization in existence with a mission to provide comprehensive, data-driven insights that inform public understanding, scientific exploration, and global policy, led by CEO Mindy Toutfest. The nonprofit is currently compiling databases on UFO incidents and using artificial intelligence to filter information and spot trends. Rogers now joins a growing number of whistleblowers telling lawmakers that we have recovered and replicated alien spacecraft. He said it was testimony from others that finally persuaded him to come forward. In 2023, a senior Department of Defense intelligence officer, David Grush, came forward telling Congress under penalty of perjury that he was informed in the course of his official duties as a multi-decade unidentified aerial phenomena crash retrieval and reverse engineering program to which I was denied access. He says that his role in the Navy National Reconnaissance Office liaison to the Pentagon's UAP task force, he interviewed 40 witnesses within the government and concluded that the state had captured alien aircraft from non-human biologics. So long a ridiculed subject, obviously, support for the serious investigation of UFOs was rekindled in 2017 when that New York Times published that video from 2004 of that white Tic Tac, remember that, seen by Navy aviators off the California coast. And the candy-shaped object was traveling at breakneck speeds, performing maneuvers thought to be impossible for human craft. Said other witnesses who have learned about UAPs have given their own testimony to Congress. So I'm simply adding my voice to theirs and confirming their prior reports. As they have led the way to speaking out before me, I hope that my report may stimulate others to reveal whatever they have similarly witnessed. If you were the U.S. Air Force major who allegedly showed Rogers the eye-popping CCTV video at Cape Canaveral in the spring of 1992, please email Josh Boswell. Josh Boswell. He's an award-winning investigative journalist. He was the first reporter to authenticate Hunter Biden's infamous abandoned laptop using top cyber forensic experts. He uncovered allegations of ex-second gentleman Doug Emhoff's violence and infidelity ahead of the 2024 presidential election. And his coverage of alleged Biden family corruption won him first place for national political reporting in the Southern California Journalism's Awards in 2023. He has previous nominations for crime, politics, and corruption stories since joining the Daily Mail in 2019. His murder investigations have led to the reopening of 2 cold cases. He also covers UFOs, unearthing new information about strange objects spotted in our skies. So, wasn't that long ago, I remember there was this UFO alert in Turkey that grounded all commercial flights as well as military flights for a period of time. But, 80 years of lies and deception. I mean, is this proof of alien life on our planet? Now, the UFO disclosure that was promised by Trump, remember all the stuff that Trump said that he was going to do, end the wars in the Ukraine and in Gaza, the Ukraine war in 24 hours, all the information that he was going to release on the assassinations, the 2 Kennedy brothers, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King. And now we know who killed, because of that, we now know who killed JFK. It was redacted. And he also said he was going to release what the government knows on UFOs. And Lou Elizondo, and you can see his stuff on YouTube, Elizondo spelled just like that, Lou, L-U-E, who was the former head of the Pentagon's UAP investigation program, had made multiple appearances on Donald Trump Jr.'s podcast. But key positions were filled by individuals who previously advocated for greater transparency on unidentified anomalous phenomena, notably the newly appointed Secretary of State Rubio. He even appears in a documentary film exploring what is claimed to be the greatest cover-up of all time, one involving multiple groups of non-human intelligence. Now, in the book I mentioned earlier by Jacques Vallée, the name of it, where the first explosion took place, for Pete's sake, Jack. He talks about some of the downed spacecraft and the investigations around them. And it's like reading a science fiction novel. And just swears up and down to the truthfulness of the testimonies of the people who were immediately told by the federal government, essentially, if you talk about this, you're going to disappear. So under the Trump administration, it had been expected that a key appointment would be made within the National Security Council to orchestrate in a cohesive, clear, present manner disclosure of the UAP information. And we were told for once we would, we were set to see the full muscle of the White House backing on UAP transparency. But after all, that had been the plan from day one of the modern disclosure efforts, but under President Hillary Clinton, that was supposed to happen, but she lost. And as too was her promise to open the files as much as we possibly can. Now, the man who occupies the White House right now, President Trump has acknowledged himself on receiving briefings on UAPs. And when asked by podcaster Lex Friedman whether he would push the Pentagon to release more, Trump said, "Oh, you bet I'll do that. I would do that. I'd love to do that. I have to do that." Well, so far there's nothing that's happened. And we'll see what takes place from here. Okay, we're out of time, and I've actually had several other things I wanted to get into before the show was over. They'll have to wait till tomorrow. I hope this, Trinity. Yeah, Trinity was the name of the book by Jacques Vallée. Trinity. Doesn't cost much, and it's shocking. You want to read a book on UAPs, it's at Amazon, Trinity, by Jacques Vallée, V-A-L-L-A-E-E or something like that. You can work your way through it. So I am going to end the stream. It looks like I don't see my face. I don't see my face on there. I don't know when the screen went black. That's because I need a better computer than I have to handle this bandwidth. But I'll be back tomorrow. I hope this was entertaining for you.